Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, we would like to thank you for joining us. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Engagement. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Professor Jonathan Elmer from the IUB Department of English. A distinguished author and an acclaimed scholar of American literature and culture, Professor Elmer has written extensively on literature, race, and pop culture. His latest book, In Poe's Wake, Travels in the Graphic and the Atmospheric, explores Edgar Allan Poe's enduring and unexpected influence and is the focus of tonight's program. Following his presentation, Professor Elmer will be joined by English Ph.D. student Thade Correa for the audience Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's conversation. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Jonathan Elmer for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thanks to all of you who are here. I can't see you, but I know you're there. I can see a number at the bottom of the screen. It's great to have everyone interested in this book, and I will try to make it, try to give you a good sense of what the book is about. I think a lot of people have opinions about Poe, have knowledge about Poe, and that's ideal. So a little background. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I wrote a book about Poe. In that book, I was interested in the fact that Poe had invented or radically innovated in so many different genres that have become central in 20th century and 21st century mass culture. To give you an example, he invented detective fiction, pretty much. And everybody goes back to Murders in the Rue Morgue as really one of the first detective stories ever written. He was a major innovator in Gothic fiction. More and more people realize how important he was for what gets called weird fiction, fiction about paranormal events, about cosmic incursions and so forth. And he was a big figure in science fiction. So he did all these things. And my question in that book was, why? And how can I find out what made Poe so prescient about contemporary mass culture? And so I did a lot of examining of the book itself of his books and his stories, and tried to understand within the terms of the writing what was making him so thoughtful about these things. But what it didn't do, that book, was talk about these adaptations, these adoptions, these thematizations, these allusions, parodies, transformations, all the different ways in which Poe has been taken up in the decades after his death. I didn't do that in that book. But this book, the one that I'm talking about tonight, does exactly that. I tried to give a sense in this book of the extremely wide array of treatments of Poe in many, many different media. So for instance, in the book, I look at film, painting, artists, books, comics, free improvisation, animation, conceptual art, spirit dictation, I'll get to that later, illustration, recorded sound, point and click video games, and children's cartoons. And I'm sure I'm leaving some of the things out. But the point was I wanted to give a very wide array of a sense of how he had impacted so many people. Okay. So Poe is the best known and most influential American writer across the globe. I'm willing to argue that, and I think other people have argued it. He is instantly recognizable, and in part because of this picture and this image. This daguerreotype was taken just a couple of days after he tried to kill himself towards the end of his life. You can see the 1,000-mile stare in his eyes. And this image, more than any other, there are other daguerreotypes of Poe, but this is the one that everybody goes to. If you go to Etsy, for example, to look for merch, this is the image more than any other that gets reproduced on the bobbleheads and coffee cups and T-shirts with jokes from Queen, like he's just a Poe boy from a Poe family. Um, Poe's reputation is as a drunk and an outcast, and that's kind of true, though much exaggerated in the history. But I think we need this myth for some reason. In any case, it is ascribable probably to Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, who translated a great deal of Poe and was the conduit, the main conduit for Poe's impact on Europe and European literatures. Here you see the cover of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and you see right at the top with a little space next to him, the picture of Poe, the face of Poe, and it's from that daguerreotype. Um, and so you have a sense of just what a celebrity he was. He's rubbing shoulders with all the other celebrities on the cover of that album, and you can see the language from "I Am the Walrus." One of the lyrics is, "Man, you should have seen them kicking Edgar Allan Poe," and the idea that Poe was an outcast, that he was kicked, that he was very badly treated, is something that has grown up as part of his myth and part of his brand. And Baudelaire has given that to us, but so the Beatles take it up anyway. And it seems as though we really like that. I argue in the book that Poe is an author, but he's also a brand. And by that, I mean that he has certain kinds of features that are so instantly recognizable and so quickly associated with other things that we might as well be talking about a product. Um, Part of the brand is clearly the face. His visage is so instantly recognizable that that's part of it. It's like the mark for a brand. Um, he appears as a character in many of the adaptations of his work. It's very weird how often he appears as a character, but again, that's because his biography is so important for people. Another feature of the brand is that people feel free to grab anything from his total work and mix and match things from different stories and mash them together. And that's good enough. That's close to the brand. We're not actually reproducing a particular story with any fidelity. We're just invoking Poe and the kinds of grisly, macabre, melancholy, and surreal atmospheres of his work. I can give you an example. The uh, the Netflix movie A Pale Blue Eye that came out a few years ago is about murders at West Point. Christian Bale tries to solve these murders. It's a detective story. So it's a detective story that's already invoking the Poe brand. Poe himself is in the story. Poe did spend time at West Point, and he's kind of a Watson to Christian Bale's Holmes in the story. But most interestingly is that the title of the movie, The Pale Blue Eye, has nothing to do with the story that's being shown to us. There is no pale blue eye in the story, but it is a phrase from the Telltale Heart, and it may be that people just know that phrase, but in any case, it's just dropped from another story into this one, and that's typical of the Poe brand, and you'll have some other examples as I go on and talk about things. Wednesday, the series also invokes the Poe brand, just simply with having the place called Nevermore. The Fall of the House of Usher Netflix series is another mashup of all kinds of different stories. I could go on and on about the ways in which people have taken Poe and done this kind of amalgamation, I guess you would call it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these terms, the graphic and the atmospheric, and then I'm going to run through some greatest hits from the book, and I will be sure to leave enough time for us to have a good amount of time for questions. So my puzzle in writing, the really difficult thing in writing this book was to organize this extraordinarily wide array of material. And I needed some vernacular, what I thought of as vernacular categories. And these are what the graphic and the atmospheric are. We talk about a movie that's graphic. We talk about a movie that's atmospheric. We don't have very precise things that we mean by that, but we sort of know what we mean, and we can convince each other. If you were to say to somebody who knows Poe's work pretty well, his work is graphic and atmospheric, that person might say, yeah, it's violent. You know, people get killed, they get cut up, they get put under the floorboards. Yeah, it's grisly. So I guess it's graphic in that sense. And yeah, there's a lot of suspense and weird dread in these stories, many of these stories. There's also just sort of atmospheric effects, curtains moving and dead spirits coming back from the dead. It's atmospheric. Okay, I accept that. But I take these terms not just as vernacular categories, aesthetic categories, but I push them a little harder. And I think this has turned out to be the way in which the book is organized. So the graphic, as I use it, takes in the very large number of the array of images that we have come to live with, which have exploded since Poe's death in 1849. Photography had been invented. Poe wrote a little piece about photography, but in the second half of the 19th century, also illustration as an art form, illustration right next to the texts that it was illustrating exploded as well. And of course, then we get cinema and we get animation, we get TV and all the rest of it. So it goes on and on. That's what I'm thinking about as part of the graphic as well. And then with regard to the atmospheric, I extended beyond suspense and obscurity to ask about something more like a cosmic dimension. Poe was very interested in the cosmos. He wrote a cosmology, and he's very interested in voices coming from beyond. And that's something that people have really picked up on in various kinds of media. And I treat all those things as atmospheric as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just walk us through some things and try to explain them a little bit, and then I'll stop and we'll have some questions. So two examples of graphic Poe. On the right, you see an image by Edouard Manet, a famous French painter who, together with Stéphane Mallarmé, put together what is often called the first artist's book, where it's not just the poem The Raven, which is what it was, Mallarmé's translation of The Raven with 6 images done by Manet, but the book itself is an artwork. So it's not just a treatment, it's an artist's book in that sense. These images by Manet are very, very modern. It dates from the 1870s. And he's very interested in the Raven's story about shadow and being put under a shadow. That's kind of the story of the Raven. There's darkness outside, the darkness comes inside with the Raven. And you see the shadow of the Raven there on the floor. You can see his beak. And the chair is where the narrator had been. The narrator is no longer around, but has been reduced by Manet to a series of very, very black inky marks. And I think that this is Manet playing with the graphic features of his medium, something that many, many other artists do in different ways. They're very striking images, and happy to talk more about them later. On the left is a panel or is a page from Alberto Breccia, an Argentinian comics artist from the 20th century. Here, what Breccia has done is taken the specific powers and conventions of the 9-panel grid, which is the sort of default for comics, and routed Poe's story, The Telltale Heart, through it. In The Telltale Heart, the narrator describes opening the door to spy on the man with the terrible eye that's haunting him. And he says, it took me an hour to open the door enough so that I could look in on the eye. So that's a really, really slow opening. If you think that he has to open it maybe 6 inches. And that's what Breccia has done here. He's using the repetitions of the grid to have the door open a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And you get that energy, the slowness of it, but you get that kind of suspense that the story itself is telling in a graphic form. Again, he's using the affordances of the medium for his own purposes, and then he channels Poe's message through that. It's very ingenious, I think. Poe wrote a lot of stories about people who were walled up, or they were chopped up, they put under the floorboards. It's very violent. Or they were walled up alive, they're walled up dead, they awaken buried alive. In the Pit and the Pendulum, the narrator is in a pitch black chamber, a torture chamber. So this is a motif of Poe's, this black box, I call it. And I think that the graphic artists really found this powerful. They wanted to think about blackness as something that they had to try to represent, almost paradoxically, because they had to show something. Can't just show blackness. If you look on the right, you see an image by Odilon Redon, another European painter. These are his noirs. He did a whole series of things that were dedicated to Poe. This one is very specifically linked to the Telltale Heart. So in the Breccia, we saw the man opening the door and looking in, and that's probably what we're looking at here. But Redon leaves it very uncertain. Are we looking in, or is that person looking in at us? Are we looking? It's very unclear where we are supposed to be. And what's more, to either side of the eye, this sort of suspended eye, are floorboards. This is clearly wood with knots in it, and you think they're floorboards. Maybe they're timbers on a wall. But given that the old man with his eye had been buried under the floorboards, it's even possible that this is some sort of weird version of the old man dead, looking up. The eye doesn't die, as it were. On the left is a very little known volume from 1940s, an Italian artist named Pietrino Vicenzi. And all I wanted to show here was how he is using the framing of his image, this sort of almost coffin-shaped frame, to capture the blackness of the room as a kind of as a sort of an energy field. That's what you see here. You see all these striking lines going out. The guy he's killing the old man. Somehow he's managing to sort of bend the bed to kill the old man. You can see the old man's eye beaming out from beneath the bed. But my interest here was in how the containment of the image is dedicated to showing the power and all the energy going in and out of it. And that's what I think people respond to in Poe's stories. They are very tight. They're very taut, but they're just sort of alive with energy, and a lot of it very difficult energy. But it's exciting to try to depict it in graphic form. Okay. Now, with the graphic artists, painters, illustrators, etchers, they have to make black marks. They have to, or colored marks in the case of painters. They have to make marks. And that's one path that they follow in trying to think about Poe's black boxes, for instance. But when you get to photography and especially cinema, the graphic is the photographic. It's light. It's graphic with light. And you can't do a cinema if you don't illuminate things. Things have to be shown. The filmmakers that I discuss in the book solved this problem or thought about this problem quite ingeniously. And what you're looking at here is Bela Lugosi talking to what's his name? Amos. Can't think of it right now. It'll come back to me. Anyway, this is a film based on the Boris Karloff. Based on The Black Cat. It's called The Black Cat. It's directed by Edgar G. Ulmer, an emigre director who went on to do some of the more famous noirs in the 1950s. 1933, or I think, or 32, part of that series of horror films that Universal put out in the early 30s, including Frankenstein and Dracula and things like that. This is the first film in which Karloff and Lugosi appeared together. The film has absolutely nothing to do with Poe's story. It's called The Black Cat. It has absolutely nothing to do with the story, but it is a great example of the brand. And by that, I mean what Ulmer has done, has thought about, okay, what are Poe's stories about? Well, there's a lot of killing of beautiful women. He likes to do that. He says it's the most poetical topic in the world, is the death of a beautiful woman. There's underground spaces in which rather dire things take place. Karloff in this has a basement, which is what we're looking at right here, where he performs black mass operations, and people are sacrificed. Young women are sacrificed. These are all themes that are very, very evocative of Poe. They are part of the brand, but he has to make it visible. And so what he does, instead of showing you a big black room, he actually inverts the whole thing. And what you get are the corpses of these women. I know it's very grim and grisly, but that's Poe. Um, the corpses of these women suspended. You can't quite see, but she's suspended in a kind of a coffin-shaped vitrine. So instead of it being the darkest place you could possibly imagine, there's a kind of strange glow. It's still terrifying, and that's the achievement of Ulmer, that he makes this extremely creepy. The woman that we're looking at is actually Bela Lugosi's former wife, who he's lost touch with, and so this is a very intense scene. I read I read about this actress whose name which escapes me right now, but she said, "Yeah, this was the worst gig I ever had. They had to make special pants for me to sit in so that I could be suspended from above, and one day they went to lunch and they didn't even get me out of the getup. I was just sitting there suspended." Uh, this was early 30s was the beginning of the Hays Code, the censorship code in Hollywood. Joseph Breen was the man charged with enforcing the code. He wrote to Ulmer, having seen the script. He said, "Look, you cannot flay, you cannot have Bela Lugosi flay Boris Karloff alive. That's just not on. You can't do that." And what's more, all these women in these coffin-shaped vitrines. Think about that again. I think that's a problem. So Ulmer goes back to the drawing board and he says, "Okay, we'll flay Boris Karloff only in silhouette. So that'll get by, and nobody will see any blood or anything like that." But these coffin-shaped vitrines are fantastic. I love them, and I'm going to have more of them now. He asked me to rethink it. I'm rethinking it. So in fact, he goes out and he hires some more actresses. He gets some more vitrines. It's quite a scene. This early years of the Hays Code are filled with stories like this, and everybody's trying to figure out what they can and can't get away with. So this is the sort of second phase of me thinking about the graphic, in terms of the graphic of light, if you like. And this is, I think, one of the more interesting examples of that. The second half of the book dedicates itself to thinking about the atmospheric in Poe's work. Um, on the left, you see Claude Debussy. I just chose that image because I liked his hat. Debussy spent most of his adult life trying to finish an opera based on Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. He never did finish it. It lay unfinished when he died. Uh, there's pretty good evidence that he was just really hung up with the form of opera, and that the form of opera was not allowing him to do what he wanted to do with the story. The story, you may recall, is very, very atmospheric. It's very moody. There's all kinds of creepy things going on in the House of Usher. There's actual atmosphere itself. There's a huge storm at the end of the story that causes the house to break in part and fall into the little pond. And this moved Debussy, because Debussy was very interested in evanescence. He was interested in things changing quickly and so in indeterminacy. If you think about how his music works, there's oftentimes the intimation of a certain kind of tonal center, but then it sort of slides off of it, and everything sort of moves very gracefully. And that is what he saw in the House of Usher, and that's what he wanted to put into his opera. He called it the flou. In French, flou means vague, indeterminate. He wanted his music to be flou. Opera didn't allow him to be flou. And so I think he didn't succeed in that, unfortunately. But he did finish some of the arias, and they have been recorded, and they're very good. I mean, as you would imagine. On the right is somebody who understood the flou using a different medium. This is Jean Epstein, a film director from the French expressionist, avant-garde expressionist movement of the 1920s. This is a silent film called La Chute de la Maison Usher, The Fall of the House of Usher. Epstein believed that cinema could see things that human beings couldn't see, which is kind of true. And for that reason, he experimented a lot with various kinds of techniques. Here you see superimposition. This is a still, but in the actual movie, you see her head, sort of two different heads waggling at the same time. he thought of this as cinema's ability to actually see the transitions between life and death, which he thought were not really very important. And he takes the story of the fall of the House of Usher as an occasion to experiment with film's capacity to do that kind of work of doing the atmospheric work. There's a lot of rustling curtains and wind blowing and straight atmospheric, but there's this other deeper sort of existential atmospheric stuff that he's doing with film. It's a wonderful movie. It's about an hour long. I highly recommend it. It's available on YouTube. It's one of the best adaptations in film of Poe that I know, and it's a very innovative treatment. Okay, I'm going to move on. I want to make sure we get enough time to have questions. This is a still from a music video. I'm not sure I listed music video in my initial list of things. Anthony Roth Costanzo is a countertenor who put out an album called Glass Handle. Half of the musical numbers were by Philip Glass and the other by Handel. This is a music video made. He had several of them made into music videos. This is from the aria from Philip Glass's opera. He did succeed in writing an opera. Philip Glass's opera on the scene in which Roderick Usher says, "All things are alive." You can see that goes back to Epstein. Everything is alive. The stones in my house are alive. The cosmos is what things that look like they're dead, they're alive. So this it's very difficult to convey why this feels so atmospheric. This music video, you can see some strange samurai figures coming out from the shadows on the left. The model moving towards us. The entire thing is she's just walking straight towards the camera. She's shaved. There's a kind of a hint of a sort of hermaphrodite feel to it. That's appropriate to the story. Roderick Usher and Madeline Usher are twins, and they sort of converge at the end of the story. Most peculiarly and most possibly atmospheric in my understanding, though I'm not sure how I explain it, is this big pink tank that follows her throughout the entirety of this song, of this aria. But we hear Anthony Ross Costanzo singing as a countertenor Philip Glass's aria. Glass did other things on Poe. He did some music for a dance performance based on Poe's Descent into the Maelstrom. And here too, I think he's thinking about what Poe gives him for his medium. Glass was a minimalist, is a minimalist, was a minimalist, and very interested in sort of producing immersive experiences for his listeners. And the story of Descent into the Maelstrom is two fishermen going into a vortex, and they go down and down and down, and it repeats. They see things spinning around and around and around in the vortex, and you can see how this gets translated into Glass's repetitions and sense of immersion. And that's what you feel when you listen to that particular piece of music. Again, an example of how these artists are taking ideas they find in Poe and making them work as places to explore the limits and powers of their own medium. The first kind of remediation of Poe after he died. Poe died in 1849. Starting in the 1850s and into the 1860s, there were a whole bunch of spirit mediums that were going around having events where they would recite poems that they claimed had been dictated to them by Poe. Some of them were published, many were not. This made sense for a lot of people because, of course, this was a time of spirit medium in general. This was a very common thing in 19th century America. But it also exemplifies how Poe is associated with the voices from the dead. Many of his stories have that feel or talk about that. Uncanny voices. The Raven, of course, in the Raven is speaking. It says one word, but it's speaking. When they invented recorded sound, they would run around the states doing exhibitions of this amazing technology, and it was already clear to everybody that what was coolest about recorded sound was that you could actually hear things that were from the past, and most importantly, you could hear the voices of dead people. And so these exhibitors thought, we'll make sure we have Poe as one of the people that we record, and we can have somebody reciting Annabelle Lee or something. And that'll make sense for the people who are watching this new technology. So what you're seeing here are somewhat more whimsical. These are both late 19th century things. The thing on the right is Charles Sanders Peirce, the famous scientist and philosopher, American philosopher, who we know from evidence knew the Raven by heart for 50 years, 40 years before he did this. We don't know what this is. This is in the archives. It's he never wrote about it. It's him transcribing in really loopy, weird way the beginning of the Raven, Once Upon a Midnight Dreary. And I have a theory. It'll take too long to try to describe the theory, but I puzzled about this this image for a long time. I just love it. I don't know what Peirce was up to, but it seems to be trying to capture something about the atmosphere of Poe's poem, which was one of the most popular poems in the 19th century. I just mentioned that there is in the poem The Raven a bird that repeats one word over and over again. Everybody knew this poem, and they knew that word. They knew the bird said those words. This on the left is a patent that was granted for some brothers who were putting together a recording. It was basically an advertisement. It was a recording device, early recording device, that would advertise their ointment for corns, and that they put it in a bird. And so this thing would just say, whatever, buy our corn ointment over and over and over and over again. Repetition. I think this pretty clearly an allusion, if you like, to Poe's bird that says one word and only one word. And now it's oral in this new recorded mode. Very strange. Okay. And I'm going to wrap up here with SpongeBob SquarePants, which some of you will know, is a children's cartoon from the 1990s. My kids watched it. The guy who pitched this show originally had, as one of the episodes that he pitched to the people to give him the money, an episode called Squeaky Boots. And Squeaky Boots is based on the Telltale Heart. In the Telltale Heart, you remember, the eye of the old man is causing a kind of psychotic episode in the narrator. He has to kill the old man because of the eye. Okay, great. He chops him up. He puts him under the floorboards. But then he hears the heart continuing to beat, and it beats and it beats, and he's being driven mad by the beating of the heart. The police are there. He's trying to overcome his madness, but he can't. And he rips up the floorboards and he says, "I did it. It was the beating of his hideous heart." Okay, you need to know that to understand Squeaky Boots. In Squeaky Boots, Mr. Krabs gives some squeaky boots that his daughter has spurned to SpongeBob. SpongeBob, being who SpongeBob was, loves them because they make an incredible amount of very irritating noise. And they go back and forth and back and forth, and he just drives Mr. Krabs completely crazy. So like the heart, he's being driven crazy. Mr. Krabs steals the boots, buries them under the floor, but also can't stop hearing the squeaking of the boots, and pulls up the floorboards and says, "It was the squeaking of his hideous boots." And what I love about this kind of redo, if you want to call it that, of Poe's story is, again, that Ellenberg is thinking about the medium itself, his medium, which is children's cartoons. And you will probably agree with me that children's cartoons are fundamentally focused on making a lot of very irritating noise. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of sound effects. The sonic world is completely full. And what's more, the cartoons can function like the squeaking of boots for the parents who are in another room, but they're hearing, there's this crazy noise. So it's kind of a meta commentary on the form of children's cartoons. And I treat all these oral sonic events under one category of a kind of atmosphere. And that's actually the last instance in the book. So I will stop there, and I will invite Thade to join us at this point so he can send me some questions.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jonathan. That was wonderful. And thank you for this opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to go in order. And it looks like we have three questions right now. So I'll just start in with Warren. Warren asks, radio was a good medium for Poe. Who did Poe the best in radio drama?
Um, I talk about a particular show from Inner Sanctum from the 30s, which is I'm trying to remember who actually is the voice in it, the main voices in it. There's so many names that I can't remember them all, but it's a very funny show where the many people have written about this show. They say it's not a good redo of Poe. It's not meant to be a redo of Poe, really. It's just a story that they could do creepy things with, but they also make little jokes within it about their advertisers. Again, a lot of these people are taking things up from Poe because he's recognizable, because he's a brand, giving you just enough of the creepiness of it. Inner Sanctum is a kind of a ghost story series that they had, but also using it to make all kinds of jokes and do other kinds of things with their medium. So that's the one I write about in the book. There, as you say, there were others, um, but it's an example with radio of again a voices coming from who knows where. When radio first started out, there was a thought, wait a minute, I don't know where these voices are coming from. There was thought that things were coming from the moon. I'm not kidding. There was a lot of sort of anxiety about these disembodied voices coming in, and Poe was great for that because a lot of his stories have to do with people hearing things and responding to things that are probably imaginary. Um, so that's not a full answer, but that's at least a bit of an answer.
Excellent, excellent. I see a question from Sammy, and it looks like there's a little bit of I'm going to paraphrase it the best I can. Thank you for this. I love the cover and subtitle. In a previous talk, you noted the influence Daniel Hoffman's book, Poe, many, many times, had in figuring out how to write about your varied ideas about Poe, how to tie them in how to tie them all in together. How do you see that influence working in travels in the graphic and the atmospheric particularly?
No, this is Sammy. I think I know who Sammy is. The allusion to the book by Daniel Hoffman is to his study of Poe called Po, which is seven repetitions of the name to match the seven repetitions of the word the bells in the bells, 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 bells. And a lot of it was that book was about the kind of funny place where Poe is both kitschy and avant-garde. He's both, and this is true in my book too. The people who don't like Poe, and there are plenty of people who don't like Poe, tend to be sort of middle-brow people. There's the avant-garde love him. The really kind of kitschy mass culture people love him. But it's the curators of the culture. T.S. Eliot wrote a very famous takedown of Poe that he didn't like. He didn't like Poe. He thought, I don't understand why people love him so much. He's childish. Okay, well, maybe. But Hoffman had done a book that was talking a lot about the sound effects of Poe, hence his interest in The Bells, which is a poem about sound effects. And he wrote a book that was for a general reader, more so than mine, I think, though I like to think mine is approachable by non-academics and can be fun for them. And so I took two things from Hoffman. One was experimenting with style, and the other was this really intense interest in sound effects, which becomes the last chapter of my book.
Great, great. I see another question by Dwayne. He says, "Many thanks. Certainly, the influence of Poe's work presented in various forms of modern art. I wonder how you consider the doppelganger motif found in many of Poe's stories. How does it contribute to the graphic and the atmospheric qualities that you have discussed?"
That's an interesting question. I do talk a little bit about some of the doppelganger effects, um, uh, but in a very specific way. I don't talk about the story William Wilson, which has a man and two people named William Wilson who are sort of confronting each other. But I do talk a little bit about the man of the crowd, which is a story about a man who sees an old man in the crowd and becomes fascinated with this old man and follows him. And he realizes this old man always has to be in the crowd. So as soon as he's in a part of the city where people leave, he has to scurry to another part of the city where there's a new crowd. And at the end of the story, the narrator walks right up to the man of the crowd and confronts him face to face. And so there's a little bit of a doppelganger type effect right there. They're joined, but the man of the crowd doesn't even see him, doesn't acknowledge him, and so there's a kind of failed, yeah, there's a failed recognition, and the double remains completely obscure or out of explanation. There's a painting that I talk about in the book by Magritte called Reproduction. Reproduction interdite. You can't, no reproductions allowed. And it's typical Magritte surrealist, and it bears on the theme that I just mentioned. It's his patron, Mr. James, English patron, that bought and commissioned a lot of paintings from Magritte, looking in the mirror. And what you see in the mirror is the back of James's head. So the mirror is not. We see two versions of the back of James's head, and it's this weird non-recognition, non-reflective quality that Poe is quite interested in using in some of those stories. That's about Poe, I know, because on the ledge of the mirror in the painting is a copy of Poe's Arthur Gordon Pym in Baudelaire's translation. And that's reflected accurately for reasons that are worth thinking about. But it's all seems to be under the kind of tutelage or yeah, covering of Poe in a kind of weird sideways way. And that at least gets at some of the issues of the doppelganger effect that he used, I think. I think it's kind of one of the more interesting ones, actually, that you can't actually have a meeting.
I see a question from Julie here about the goth aesthetic. To what extent do you think Poe, both as a character and his work, prefigure the cult of mourning and melancholia of the Victorians? Also, could he be considered a progenitor of the modern day goth aesthetic?
Yes and yes. Yes, yes, and yes. Again, it's a brand thing rather than a specific influence of a story. Though some of the stories that we know from Poe have this profound feeling of well, first of all, of melancholy, of a kind of uncontrolled melancholy, an inability to mourn properly. The narrator of The Raven is questioning the Raven as to whether he's going to see his beloved Lenore in the afterworld, and the Raven brings back the bad news, nevermore. So there is a mournful quality that's very deep in Poe that I think gets picked up in the Victorians and into the present. As far as goth styling, if you want to call it that, that's I just think, I mean, it's if you look at Wednesday, the series with Jenny Ortega, is that her name? I forget her name. Terrible names. But anyway, that's everyone's dressed in black, and they're all. But it's sort of kitschy. It's sort of scary, sort of kitschy, and that's something that shows up in Poe a lot. In fact, he talked about when he wrote The Raven, he made things comical. He made things absurd in that poem, so that when he got to the end and it was no longer absurd, it would feel even more powerful. He kind of undercut the tone, if you like, or added a sort of dissonant note so that the final effect would be sad, melancholy, and creepy. So he's very alive to this kitschy thing, and I think if you look at many of the redos of Poe, it has this feeling, and certainly the Gothic ones, it has this feeling of combining gruesomeness with kitsch. Uh,
I see George says, how would you consider the Baltimore Ravens NFL nomenclature given Poe's numerous geographical homes and domiciles?
Look, anybody can claim him than one. He lived in like six different places. As far as I'm concerned, you know, he lived in Fordham in New York. Obviously, there's Richmond. He was at West Point. He was in Boston. He was born in Boston. Um, Philadelphia and New York is where he lived the most. Um, the time in Baltimore is, of course, momentous because that's where he died. Um, and there is a monument there. That was put up in, I guess, the late 19th century. It's got a poem by Mallarmé. Mallarmé wrote a sonnet about Poe, and that's there on that monument. And Poe's house is a museum there. Um, I think it's I think it's great that the Ravens did this. I don't know that it means too terribly much about Poe's work, and it's a cool image for a team anyway. So yeah, I think anybody can claim him if they want. As I say, he spent most of his time in Philadelphia and in New York.
Laura here says, can you talk more about how Poe came to be associated with camp? Do you know when that association began?
Um, well, I don't know when it began, but as I say, there are places in Poe where he himself um, uh, talks about producing certain kinds of dissonant effects of humor, of kind of sick humor, and it wouldn't be camp yet, but certainly the kind of irony that is fundamental to a camp sensibility. The sort of we're going to play along and we're going to go all out in costuming and all the rest of it, but we're all doing it for fun. It's not really that serious, and we keep a distance from what we're doing. That was a technique that Poe used in various kinds of ways. He wrote a lot of strange stories that these days just seem ridiculous. I mean, there's one called Loss of Breath, in which the main character is carved up in various ways but continues to live. He loses his breath. It's violent, but it's also funny and campy. So as far as when it starts, I'm not sure. But I think already when you look at that black cat that I showed, the Ulmer movie, there are a lot of campy elements there. You know, uh, he says, Boris Karloff says, even the phone has gone dead. All kinds of little jokes about how creepy everything is. And that's already, you see that, and then you follow that into later 20th century horror movies, and you get all kinds of ones that are very, very grisly, but also kind of jokey at the same time.
I see Paul asking, it seems most films about Poe's works are, to generously put it, loose adaptations of his stories. Do you think this is because filmmakers are far more interested in graphic and atmospheric interpretations of his work than they are the stories themselves?
Yes, uh, I do. I mean, there are some that are pretty close, that stick pretty close. And even the ones that stick pretty close, sometimes they combine two different stories. So, for instance, that Jean Epstein movie that I talked about, it's the fall of the House of Usher as the frame tale, but into the middle of it, he drops a story called The Oval Portrait. And he's interested in the themes and particular aspects of the themes of those two stories. They come together for him. Um, yes, I think they're mostly interested in mood, atmosphere, and effects. They're very interested in sort of these violent effects. One of the reasons Poe gets taken up by these new media, you can talk about this in terms of early cinema. Early cinema, they couldn't make long movies. These things were like 6 minutes, 5, 6 minutes. D.W. Griffiths already has two shorts on Poe in 1909. So it's very early. Poe wrote short stories. They're not just short stories; they're short stories. Most of them, some of them are 8 pages. Um, And so the kind of compactness of the story, and the fact that people remember the stories, or at least the main parameters of the story, recommends Poe to these people who are trying to do something very striking with powerful effects in a short amount of time. And this is why the stories, I think, are more effective than in terms of redos than the poems. Though, as you point out, a lot of the images and films that have, and other things that have been made include Poe as a character. One of those two films by D.W. Griffiths is a story about the writing of the Raven, where the narrator of the Raven is Poe. And of course, that's not what the poem is about. But you get a character dressed like Poe, and that's the Poe of the outcast, the drunk, the mournful, the part of the brand that I started the entire talk with, the sort of thousand-yard stare. And people really love that. I mean, he comes back. He's got enough money to get medicine for his dying wife, Virginia, and he finishes the poem, but she's already died, and so. Um, so I think there's a formal quality in Poe that's very attractive for a variety of reasons, and there's this brand quality of themes, um, and his life, which is very, very riveting for people. Of course, made up a lot of it.
The last question on the docket is from Julia. Did Griswold's criticism of Poe enhance more than detract his renown as a brand later on?
Well, that's a great question. Griswold was his literary executor. He was Rufus Wilmot Griswold was a frenemy. Poe named him. Poe said, "You should be my executor." And indeed, he put out, Griswold did the first edition of Poe's work, really, I think only 1 or 2 years after Poe died. So he did a great service in that regard. But in that edition, he also put in a kind of a short biography of Poe, in which many of the motifs of Poe's drunkenness and his egocentrism and his loneliness and his outcast qualities were written down. And at the time, a lot of people were very angry about this. And certainly some of the Poe fans from 20 years after this went after Griswold like, hammer and tongs. But even going after it, the myth is part of what's being discussed, right? So it lives on whether you agree with it or not. I would say, as I said in the beginning, that the person most responsible for keeping that the Griswold myth, if you like, alive and well, is that whatever Griswold thought was bad, Charles Baudelaire thought was good. So, so it's, okay, he's an outcast, and the people don't appreciate him, and he's a drug addict, and so am I, and and that's what being an artist in this terrible bourgeois era is supposed to be. And so I think that's the cemented. I think Baudelaire cements what Griswold puts in place.
Oh, and we have another question from Robert. Thanks for the talk. I find the pairing of graphic and atmospheric is compelling as an analysis of vernacular aesthetics. Have you drawn any connections for these terms to other kinds of theories or ongoing debates, such as an eco-criticism?
Yeah, well, there's some eco stuff in the book, not much, but there is the recognition that when we talk about atmosphere, we're actually talking about atmosphere. I mean, air, a lot of the time. And yes, I have done some thinking about how these terms apply, especially atmosphere, actually. Um, and there's some good work on how, especially in uh, the business world, the advertising world, people realize now 30, 40, 50, 40 years ago, what you need to do is you need to sell an atmosphere. You don't need to sell a product. You need to sell an atmosphere. And that's going to trigger people's delight in the product, but that's what they really want. And I talk about how atmosphere is this kind of elusive, evanescent, and appropriate for a life in which we feel as though we are entirely mediated, that we live in mediation all the time, and everything is sort of passing. Everything's passing by us, through us. And that's part of what the atmospheric means for us. So yes, I think there is work that's out there, and a lot of people in art history are interested in, and in architecture. There's a very powerful book by two architects. Palasma is one of them, about how what architects have to think about is the creation of atmosphere. They have to think about what does it feel like to be in this room? How does the outside of the building get inside the building? And so forth and so on. These are questions about atmosphere, mood, affect, but also atmosphere. So yes, it is rich. I have thought about it. I think it would be fun to teach a class on that and try to think about what could be put together on that. But it's a great question. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much. I actually have a question for Professor Elmer. I had a number of questions, and I was wondering, this kind of goes what we were talking about just uh, most recently too. This kind of goes along with it. I was thinking as you were talking about Poe and futurity, and I'm thinking of um, kind of what kind of future genres do you, and I guess I'm asking you to do some prediction here. I'm thinking of how Poe, people think of him as predicting the existence of black holes, or the spirit mediums you talked about, and how the atmospheric and these sorts of things go along with the kind of interest in maybe a future, or a weird kind of future, or alternative futures. And I just wondered if you had predictions of new genres or new forms that.
I don't, but I think you're on the right track with weird fiction and what's often called speculative sci-fi, speculative fiction. These are artistic endeavors that are focused on all kinds of things that we think of as paranormal, um, uh, out-of-body experiences, transmigrations of various kind. What things that we used to think of as magic are understood. And I think we are, look, there's all kinds of good evidence that we live in a much more disembodied way than we used to because of our media hookups. We are sort of uploaded, as it were, into our media, and with VR, we're very feeling as though we're in that scene. Our body is in that scene because the VR gives us a chance to feel that way. So these are experiments with out-of-body experiences that Poe thought a lot about and influenced a lot of other people in thinking about. And there is this interest in speculative fiction that I think is heading towards that. Yeah,
That's awesome.
good question.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time for the night, so I will turn it back over to Vanessa.
Thank
And
you.
thank you.
Great. Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to personally thank Professor Elmer and Mr. Correa for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. I would like to acknowledge the IU Alumni Association for assisting with tonight's event. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support programs like tonight's presentation or other opportunities that connect alumni and friends with the College of Arts and Sciences and Indiana University, please consider making a contribution to the IU Bloomington College Alumni Engagement Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. We look forward to connecting you with the college and each other again soon. Until next time, take care.